If we could resume. Kurt, I think we stopped where you were getting ready to answer questions and show us more of your presentation.
Right. I do have a PowerPoint that goes through the proposed permit in a little more detail.
Money out of the pockets
That's not
of
it.
Americans just at a time.
Okay. Again, I'm Kurt Birchtold with the Santa Ana Regional Board. I wanted to give you a little more detail on some of the details of the proposed permit that we developed, as well as the process that the Regional Board has gone through in considering the permit. Now, as you know, this is a sector-specific permit. The sector that we've identified is based on SIC code 5093, but it narrows the definition of facilities that would be covered under the permit in order to include facilities that are as similar as possible. So in the Santa Ana region, that left us with 52 facilities that would be subject to the permit as drafted.
Kurt, before you move on from this, with respect to either this limited SIC code or these 52 facilities, what have you done an analysis? Have you determined what level of water quality threat they pose? And in terms of prioritizing regional board focus, how would this how would their level of water quality threat rank among your priorities?
You know, certainly the nature of these types of operations are that they have a significant potential to cause problems, and you know, we have seen that in the past. We have, in fact, you know, George Adams spoke previously. Once upon a time, we had an individual permit on his facility in our region because we thought it had some unique characteristics. How this particular sector would compare to other industrial sectors is something we have not analyzed, but I think the main reason we focused on this particular sector is because we had both the industry and environmental interest, and to a large extent I think that interest was driven by the significant potential for problems from this industry, and that then gave us the opportunity to use information provided by the industry and provided by consultants that participated in our group to craft a sector-specific permit. So, you know, this may or may not be the highest priority, but it was really kind of a combination of it being a significant potential problem with a good availability of information that allowed us to draft this permit.
And I have one question too. In terms of the statewide applicability of this permit, are you going to deal with that in your PowerPoint?
I hadn't specifically spoke to that, but I think Chair Hoppen made a comment earlier expressing an opinion that there wasn't anything in this permit that was really unique to the Santa Ana region, and I would agree with that. I think the permit as drafted would lend itself to statewide consideration. So the general structure of the permit, it includes two options. There's a three-phased approach or a strict numeric effluent limit approach. And that second option is the one that includes a number of CTR-based NELs. Frankly, we don't think many or any facilities would choose that option, but we did include it based on the recommendation of the committee that helped us to draft the permit. We think that the three-phased BMP-based option is the one that most facilities would choose, and the facilities do get to self-select their option at the time they apply for coverage under the permit. We also include a design storm for sizing treatment controls. It's a 95th percentile storm. And then we have stormwater pollution prevention plan and monitoring requirements included within the permit. Going through the phased option, in phase 1, you would develop your SWIP, which includes a rain event action plan, and phase 1 would also require a series of 23 preventative or site design or housekeeping type BMPs. These are all pretty conventional things, but the fact that this is a sector-specific permit allowed us to provide some specificity and tailor them to this particular industry. The structure of the permit is we do have, even in option 1, we have some NELs and NALs. Those initially would apply only as triggers, and there would be a triggering mechanism that would mean if you exceeded those, you would have to implement a phase 2 plan. Now, under phase 2, facilities would be required to submit a corrective action plan that would include both additional preventative measures and also would include treatment controls in phase 2. And then if you continued to exceed NELs or NALs, then a phase 3 corrective action plan would be required that would evaluate the effectiveness of everything that's been thus far and propose improvements. That would be submitted to regional board staff who would review and ultimately approve that plan. It would be required to be implemented, and that plan would serve as BAT, BCT for permit compliance purposes.
Kurt, if you could explain to me on that last presentation you gave, if the plan is to utilize best available technology, and best available technology doesn't get you to those levels, what would you envision in the additional phases?
In the third phase, it requires an evaluation of your sources within the facility. It requires you to consider all of the measures that you've implemented thus far, and to try and identify the sources of any exceedances, and to tweak the measures that you've included thus far to hopefully address those sources and eliminate the exceedances.
But you would not be required to meet your NEL. You'd be required to use best available technology and do everything else right that you've said you were going to do. Is that correct?
Once the phase 3 corrective action plan is approved and implemented, that would replace the NELs and NALs and would serve as a technology-based effluent limitation. So I've included a few slides that go over some of the NELs that we have included in the proposed permit. We've got some fairly conventional parameters that we've included here: pH, turbidity, specific conductance, oil and grease. These apply as NALs during phase 1. They later become NELs and would be exceedances would be violations of the permit. Ultimately, they would be replaced by the technology-based approach.
And what are the basis for these numbers?
These numbers, fundamentally, these are based on best professional judgment. We were able to draw on the experience and expertise of those that worked with us on the committee. We actually had facilities and consultants represented in that group who have installed treatment systems already, and so we were able to use some of their actual results from their treatment systems to help us develop what we think are achievable numbers.
Did you get an external scientific peer review?
Did we? No, we did not.
Yep.
These are some of the numeric action levels that we've got under option 1. These are based on EPA benchmarks. And then option 2, which is the one that we think few people would choose, where these NELs would apply pretty much immediately. It's got a whole series of metals limitations, and these are based on CTR. So I wanted to give you a little information on the process that the regional board went through in developing and considering the permit. I should note that to my left this morning is Michael Adakapara, who's our Stormwater Division Chief, and he's really the primary author of this permit. We've prepared 5 drafts that were distributed for review and comment. We held a workshop before the regional board on March 4th of this year. That was shortly after the first draft of the permit was released. And then we held a hearing on September 16th. We heard a bunch of comments at that one and then continued to the hearing to our October 28th board meeting, where we had a further discussion of the permit, where Board Member Doduk was in attendance. And you know, just in general, we have received a number of comments on the permit. Generally, it's supported by environmental groups. It's supported by many of the industrial permittees that would be subject to the permit, but by no means is it supported by all of the industrial permittees. We have received a number of comments from facilities that would be subject to the permit. A lot of those comments were sort of at more of a policy type level. They question the need for a sector-specific permit, particularly when the state board is in the process of developing a new statewide industrial general permit. There was an issue raised about a regional sector-specific permit creating inconsistent regulation statewide. There were concerns about increased monitoring costs, because there is an increase in the monitoring requirements that would be included in our permit. And then, of course,
Before you move off that bullet, was there an economic analysis done of options 1 and 2 and any projections of costs?
Our staff did prepare some projections of costs. We received comments on projections of costs. I don't recall the numbers as I sit here today. There would be an increase in monitoring costs. That's clear. We've provided some flexibility in the monitoring program. There's an opportunity for group monitoring as well as individual monitoring. But it's likely that there would be some increase in costs associated with the monitoring program, but we think that it's appropriate and necessary given the nature of discharges from these facilities.
And you can't recall what the costs are at this time?
I don't have the exact numbers, but they were throwing, sorry, my name is Mike Adakapara. I'm a division chief at the Santa Ana Regional Board. We heard several numbers, but the number that stuck to my mind is something like $2,000 per storm event. And if you are requiring, say,
Sorry,
4 storm events per year per facility, that will be $8,000 per storm event.
What about the cost to the regional board in terms of implementing and enforcing this permit?
This permit would certainly require a higher level of staff effort, in particular because the plans that are required to be submitted under the phased approach are required to be reviewed and approved by regional board staff before they're implemented. For our region, given the number of facilities that we have in our region, we think that is a worthwhile investment of staff effort. I can't speak to other regions that may have more facilities than we do. And just to sort of give you some information on where this ended up with the regional board. At the beginning of this item, Mr. Howard alluded to a memo that he sent to me in advance of our October 28th board meeting, where our board was scheduled to consider adoption of the permit. Based on that memo, I recommended that the board take no action on the permit at this time in order to give us the opportunity to have this discussion today and to allow the state board to consider whether you may want to take some future direction with respect to this permit. As board member Doduk knows, there was a lively discussion of my recommendation that marked by a couple of 3-2 votes by the board. Ultimately, the board decided not to take action on the permit at this time, but that it was appropriate to present the matter to the state board for consideration. However, my sense of the board at the last meeting was that the board is interested in this moving forward quickly. They do see a need for improving the regulation of this particular industrial sector in our region, at least. And they asked me to report back at our first meeting of 2012 on what we hear from you and what the status of it is from the state board. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I have a question, Mr. Howard or John, on this. I mean, where there's an acknowledgement, which kind of goes without saying, that this would require additional staff resources, and where we have all been sharply aware that we are now in a fee-based situation. How do we pay for something like this on a regional level without the regional board necessarily having the authority to assess those fees? It seems like we could get into a situation like we discussed in another region last week, where there were activities going on, but not necessarily from the resources that they were allocated for.
Well, it's a complicated question, actually, and it depends
The first
on...
one I've asked in 5 years. I'm kind of tickled about that.
Yes, it depends on how the regional board, shall we say, reports on its activities. If it needs more, if the regional board feels that they need to redirect people in their stormwater program from other programs into their stormwater programs, and if they PCP that money and it shows up that way in our budget, then we would have to amend, then we would see that as part of the cost of the stormwater program, and when we do our fees, we would amend the fees to reflect that higher cost. On the other hand, the regional board might decide to not PCP money from one part of WDPF into the stormwater program, and instead may decide to simply spend more of its stormwater resources on this particular type of facility. Under that circumstance, we wouldn't see that in the budget, and we wouldn't amend the fee regulations to reflect that. So
And
I don't know how Kurt would respond.
Yeah, I can maybe give you a regional board's perspective on that. You know, we have our stormwater program budget that includes municipal, construction, industrial, and we have sort of divided up our staff effort into those three pots. With respect to this particular permit, what it means is that we would be dedicating a somewhat higher percentage of our total industrial stormwater resources to these particular facilities as opposed to other industrial facilities. So we would be focusing a little more attention on these facilities, and some other facilities would get a little less attention than they would otherwise.
Fran?
Do you
Thank you.
anticipate, I mean, we're doing this, our statewide industrial permit, and this is a sector-specific permit, and do you anticipate other sectors wanting sector-specific permits? And are any of those in the wings, kind of waiting to see how this one goes in your region?
We're currently not doing any work to develop any other sector-specific permits. We're certainly interested in seeing how this one goes first, I think, before we embark on any other efforts.
I'm not being quiet because I don't have any more questions. I don't know where to start, to tell you the truth. I think I'm going to reserve my comment for in generality, if you will, rather than specific to this particular permit, because I do have some concerns about how we've gotten to where we are today on this and where we would go forward on something. So with that, my colleagues have anything for Kurt?
Not for Kurt, just for the conversation that we
Yeah,
had.
okay, thank you very much.
Except to say thank you. I mean, I really appreciate that you made the recommendation to your board that they delay and that you come up here and do this presentation with the stakeholders. And I think this is, if we're ever going to tie the regions and the state board more tightly together, I think this is the way to go. So I thank you.
It is the way to go. How we go there is the question I have, I suspect. But thank you, Kurt. I appreciate it very much. If we could, Mr. Loffer, and you can provide the role that Tracy was providing to the two parties on the other side of her. If you need to throw up your hand or a piece of paper at us, you can do that. But, you know, removing ourselves from the issue that's before us, I do have some concerns, and I have some accolades. I appreciate the regional board addressing this issue. I think anyone would be naive to think that these facilities aren't in a unique position to have the ability to contribute significant pollution. And I'm not saying that because I don't think that they are an integral part of our functioning society, if our society functions here. I mean, they provide a very necessary function for all of us, whether it's in California or someplace else. What I'm a bit concerned about, and Gary, I'm not picking on you, you said that, you know, if this goes into a statewide permit, and again, it can be any permit of this sort, that's fine as long as it's exactly the way it is in our permit. We don't want to change this and we don't want to change that, and yet I look at something that obviously doesn't have a very thorough cost analysis to it. It's had really no peer review, and we're not going to have the luxury of doing that here. So I couldn't tell you to your face, we're going to go ahead and take this item, whatever it is, not necessarily a scrap metal permit, up on the statewide permit, but don't worry, we're not going to change anything, because I don't have the luxury of making that promise. And going again, and it's not because I'm picking on you, just because I was listening to you, you said if we went to a statewide permit, if I understood you correctly, we'd have to start this whole process over again, and it's going to take a long time. You have a reasonable expectation from the region of initiating this program in a very short period of time. Obviously, you folks, you know, responded from, I believe, April to October on an issue, and you know, it would take us that long to come up with an acronym for this proposal, let alone get that far. And so, you know, you've moved at warp speed in bureaucracy, but your comment was if we go to a state permit, we're going to have to start this all over again, which we are, which gets to the whole concept of having not a sector-specific permit, but one that was proposed by the region. There's been an enormous amount of capital expended getting us to this point. You know, 5 drafts, all the activity you've undertaken. I guess the question there again, not to this particular permit, but to any permit like this, is that best handled by having a region come to the state board and say, you know, we have a need for this permit. It isn't geographically specific, which this one happens to not be geographically specific. We either need an individual permit or something incorporated to deal with what we feel is an environmentally egregious situation. This, I mean, I don't think anybody's going to say this is just busy work. I mean, this is an important concept, and there's a lot of other important concepts. I'm getting back to the methodology. Is it better to have a regional board, not necessarily the Santa Ana Regional Board, expend great resources to get us to the point we are today, to make the point that we need probably a statewide permit, or have it included in a statewide permit or a regionally specific permit? I don't know if that's the best use of limited resources. So if I haven't crossed any lines there, Mr. Loffer, I haven't seen you flare while I was talking. I think that needs to be part of, I believe, the discussion that Tam wanted to have. If not, I may be out on one of my orbits where I'm the only one that's concerned about this, which that's the luxury of being chair.
I personally think that there are going to be many ways that we get to statewide things, one of which will be regional boards coming up with ideas that work and get tested, and then they come to the state. But they do change. I mean, when it gets to the statewide level, no doubt about it, they do change. But I think of the trash TMDL that has been largely developed in Region 4, is now, and Region 2 is now coming in and is getting worked on. So I am not so afraid of the direction in which that having things develop at the regional board and come to the state. I do think we need to give the regions some expectation as to, how their hard work, as Charlie pointed out, and time and investment will be essentially treated by the state board. Are they in charge in moving this out to the rest of the state, or are we in charge, or is it shared charge? I mean, what are the kind of rules of the game, if you will? And because that may influence how eager regional boards are to do this kind of early heavy lifting. And so I think that's one question I have. Another is this issue of using best available technology as your ultimately your determinant of what can be done. We do set very high standards for activities, but ultimately, is the technology there that can help meet those standards, or come close to meeting them, or surpassing them? And so I'm intrigued with the idea of, on a smaller scale, not on a large scale at a statewide level, but on a smaller scale, kind of testing this kind of approach to using BATs as the determinant of what's possible, particularly if it's less than what the ultimate goal may be. And so for me, that's interesting. But I think it'd be dangerous to do it at a statewide level. So that's the thing that's interesting to me about this. And finally, I am very much a supporter of having as few region-specific activities as possible. I really think it is confusing to stakeholders, and it's basically not fair. Sometimes there is a reason for having something regionally specific, but in general, I think it's better if we have if it applies to a region and can apply statewide, it should apply statewide. And so, but I also think it's going to be essential that the regions buy into this, that this is something that they want to do as well. And so how we handle this particular this one and others that we're considering, I think is extremely important to how successful we're going to be at having statewide approaches. And separating out a sector is not I'm not opposed to that, particularly if it can be done, if the sector itself is fairly easy to separate out. But it, I think, is going to cost more time and staff to do that. So we should do it carefully and cautiously. And at this point, I feel, pretty comfortable. But if we end up having 55 sectors in the industrial permit, that then gets pretty expensive. Those are my thoughts.
Now, Tim, I guess we'll find out if this is really the discussion you had in mind when you asked to have a discussion.
Well, actually, since I can't disagree with anything you or Fran has said, I like it. I would join Fran in thanking Kurt and Michael for coming and providing us with this informational item. But I'll take it a step further and offer an apology as well. I feel, as the Santa Ana Regional Water Board liaison, that I and perhaps our staff were remiss in not having this discussion earlier. I mean, obviously, this is the 5th iteration of the draft permit, so for us to notify you, I guess the week before your last board meeting, that our executive director had a concern was a bit tardy. And so my apologies for that. And I think in moving ahead, having done this, our lessons learned is that we need to coordinate and communicate earlier with regional water boards when there is a potential issue. The discussion at the regional board meeting had, well, from 2 of the board members anyway, a slightly negative tone, and I think it was due to the fact that it was regarded as somewhat of a late hit by us, by our executive director, in sending that letter. And so again, my apologies, and we'll strive to do better in our communication. I actually am very supportive of the sector approach. If it weren't for the resource issue and perhaps a data issue, I would love for us to do our general industrial stormwater permit on a sector basis. Having said that, and I also congratulate the stakeholders and the regional board in making great stride in this particular area, with the caveat that obviously I haven't had time to get into the technical details, and it may change depending on what happens at the regional board and what is submitted to us in the record. How am I doing, Michael? From what I heard today, I mean, I would agree with some of the statements made that this particular permit may not necessarily be ready to be implemented statewide. And quite frankly, if I were to ask Tom to look at, to direct staff to look at a statewide sector-specific permit, this particular sector may not be the highest priority from a statewide perspective. I don't know. And so it does, begs the question of moving ahead. And I do want to lay the groundwork for some sector-specific permit, how we identify, how we prioritize, and how we coordinate with the regional water boards to get the most bang for our buck, if we will, the widest coverage. Because I do agree with the chair that now that we are fees-based, it does concern me in terms of, how the regional board will implement and enforce this permit, and how that be correlated to the fees that we collect up here at the state board. So, like I said earlier, I don't necessarily have specific direction, but I do appreciate that these raises these policy issue From, I think, a statewide perspective, I, for one, like the sector approach. I think it makes, when it can be done from a resource and data supported approach, it makes sense as an engineer from a technical perspective rather than a broader general permit. But having said that, I don't know that we are quite ready to go down that path without some preliminary work in identifying the data that would be needed, the resources that would be needed, and prioritizing the sectors that we would approach.
To staff, I need some help from you here, because one thing that we're on the cusp of doing, and that is stifling a stakeholder process. People will say that they didn't necessarily participate in the process, but if I'm understanding Kurt correctly, everybody had an opportunity to, whether they chose to participate or not. And as we all know, that's generally speaking how things get resolved at the Water Board. You know, if we had have come out as the state with a draft, if this was a sector-specific permit or whatever, we'd be years down the road coming up with a final draft. And so whether this is perfect or not, the idea that Mr. Adams and Mr. Brown and people came together, and I realize it was under the threat of litigation, but in fairness to the keepers, the litigation was based on a genuine environmental threat, so I'm not chiding them for unnecessary litigation. How we deal with it, I think we all have expressed concerns about this coming at a regional level, but we've got something that's close to coming into some kind of action, and we need to, through a proper procedure, which obviously we can't all get together and have a conversation like normal people would have, so we need to figure out what to do with this, because one thing I definitely don't want to do is stifle a collaborative process where industry comes together with NGOs and with the cooperation of the regional board or the state board, whoever it might be. I mean, it's the same way we wound up with a recycled water policy, quite frankly. I think the last thing we want to do is say, we appreciate what you did, but we got a better idea. I don't really know exactly how to go forward here. I don't like getting into a situation where regional permits trump state activity, but yet we've got something that's fairly well fleshed out here, maybe not thoroughly fleshed out. So how do we proceed with this without just saying to everybody, thank you for being here and we'll talk to you later, because that's not my intention.
No, I think it's commendable, the regional board and the stakeholder process that was involved, and you know, certainly no question that the process, at least from the regional perspective, was a good one. And you know, my personal opinion is I don't really have a concern, much like Fran. In fact, I'm very supportive of the fact that we should be looking to take regional approaches and move them statewide, and we should even design processes sometimes to be regionally. And in fact, you know, I think a good example right now in Region 5, they're putting together a permit for the the ASR Aquifer Storage and Recovery Project. That's a project that's important to them and that has statewide implications. You know, I think, as Tam pointed out, the real issue here, or at least a principal issue here, is the communication element. When the region wanted to develop a permit that they thought would have statewide implications at Region 5, there was, you know, some discussion with the State Water Board. There was an opportunity for other regions to get involved. You know, and in this particular case, through no fault of Region 5, I think for Region 8, I mean, they were doing what I think is sort of our standard procedure. But I do think it's critical that as we move further into the future, as people start working on issues that have statewide importance, that's clearly communicated more thoroughly throughout the organization, so that these kind of questions of whether or not it can be done on a statewide level and getting the buy-in and participation of both the people at the other regions and at the state board, and perhaps some of the stakeholders in other parts of the state involved earlier in the process, so that you know, the resources are being used as effectively as possible. It sort of gets back to the issue I'd been raising before about the you know, trying to act more as a statewide, as a single organization, and but where within the organization things are handled as a lead, I think, is going to have to shift from depending on the activity. Actually, you know, the thing that I found most interesting, I guess, in today's discussion was the, I'm sorry, I don't recall the name of the gentleman, the first speaker, and his repeated concern about the lack of a path to compliance that was available to him, and the difficulty that that was causing him in terms of staying in business. I do think that that's something that we need to focus on pretty clearly in this next draft of the industrial stormwater permit. I don't think it's reasonable or appropriate that we would have permits where people felt that there was no way to fundamentally achieve compliance, or where there was no clear path to compliance.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. So where do we go from here with this particular proposal? I mean, how do we have to be careful how we have these discussions and all, but we've got the Santa Ana region basically on hold with the proposal. I mean, the money, some of the issues we're concerned about as far as the allocation of resources, whether it was the proper circumstance or not, have been allocated. We have a fifth iteration of a proposal, and we appreciate Kurt putting the brakes on this for a while, but we need to let them know whether to go back into drive or to, you know, how to proceed. I don't know if you want to have the discussion later and we notify them, or, I mean, obviously this is not an action item today, but at some point in the very near future, we do need to take action on it, so.
Yes, as you say, it's not an action item, and yeah, personally, I'd like to go back, speak a little bit more with staff about the question of whether this should be dealt with as a statewide permit. Perhaps have a little more discussion with board members. I understand Kurt wants to get back on February 4th with his board, so it was my intent to get a response back to him before the end of the year, based on the discussions I have with staff and with the board members.
Thank you, Tom. That sounds like a plan to me.
And I think it'd be very helpful, at least for me, when we have that conversation, Tom, if you could provide some estimate of, if the board were to consider taking this permit statewide, what sort of resources are we talking about, how long it might take, and what does that mean for us in terms of other work that the industrial stormwater unit is working on?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.